Her daughter laughed at Christmas. "She's just a burden in pearls," loud enough for the whole family to hear. Eleanor Briggs, widow and mother for over 50 years, didn't spill her tea. Clara, the daughter she'd once dressed for every holiday, thought the insult would be her last word. By morning, the deed, the accounts, and the pearls would be under Eleanor's control alone. She'd been both mother and provider. Now she was the executor of her own justice. And when Clara opened her gift, the lawsuit inside would speak louder than the pearls. "I'm curious, where in the world are you joining us from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed for all the latest updates." Snow clung stubbornly to the hedges outside as Grace stepped onto the porch, the December air biting at her cheeks. Eliza's front door opened before she could knock, her daughter standing there in a shimmering emerald dress, wine glass in hand. "You're late," Eliza said, not unkindly, but with that edge Grace knew too well. Inside, warmth and light enveloped her. The rich scent of roasted turkey, the tinkling carols, the gleam of the long dining table already crowded with plates and crystal. She took her seat near the middle, between her son-in-law Mark and a nephew she barely knew anymore. Dinner began with polite chatter. Grace asked after the grandchildren's school plays, laughed gently at a cousin's joke about the weather, and complimented the cranberry sauce. She wore her pearls tonight, the same ones Robert had given her for their 25th anniversary. They rested cool and reassuring against her collarbone. Midway through the meal, after the second round of wine, the conversation shifted. Eliza leaned back in her chair, eyes glittering. "You know what Mum reminds me of?" she said, glancing around the table. Grace looked up, curious. "A burden in pearls," Eliza announced, smiling as if she'd said something clever. The table erupted in laughter. Mark's booming chuckle, a nephew's snort, even a few giggles from the cousins down the end. Grace's lips parted, but no sound came. The words landed heavy, then splintered, echoing in her head. She forced her mouth into a polite smile, willing her hand to stay steady as she reached for her glass. "Well," Mark added, raising his fork like a conductor's baton, "at least she wears them well." More laughter. No one defended her. Not a single voice cut through the mirth. The turkey cooled on her plate. Grace lowered her gaze to her napkin, tracing the stitched holly leaves with her thumb. She'd learned long ago that reacting gave Eliza more to play with. The trick was to absorb the sting in silence. Still, she felt the heat rising in her cheeks, the pearls at her throat suddenly heavier. Conversation moved on. Politics, holiday travel plans, but Grace heard none of it. The remark sat between them like a shard of glass no one acknowledged. She thought of the years she'd helped Eliza, covering rent in her 20s, babysitting without notice, cooking meals after Mark's surgery. She thought of the way her daughter had once curled into her lap as a child, trusting, unguarded. When had that warmth hardened into... A cold clarity took shape in the pit of her stomach. This wasn't the first time Eliza had cut her down, but it would be the last she'd sit through quietly. The plates were cleared, and the family migrated toward the living room for gifts. Grace excused herself to fetch her coat from the hall, but instead reached into her bag and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside, nestled on satin, was the gift she'd chosen for Eliza, a string of pearls, finer than the ones she wore tonight. She'd bought them weeks ago, imagining the pleased surprise on her daughter's face. Now, under the warm glow of the hallway light, the pearls seemed to mock her, a symbol of generosity met with disdain. From the living room came the sounds of paper tearing, the rustle of tissue, and Eliza's voice calling for her. Grace closed the box slowly, her fingers lingering on the clasp. She wondered, not for the first time, if this Christmas would be the last she spent here, at this table in this house where she was both guest and target. She slipped the box back into her bag, her decision still unformed but stirring, the way a storm builds before the first crack of thunder. Grace walked toward the living room, the gift still in her bag, a faint knowing smile touching her lips, because whatever happened next, it would not be what Eliza expected. The sting of Eliza's words burned for hours, a slow ache that clung to Grace's skin like frost. She had smiled through dessert, applauded the children's songs, and accepted the last mince pie with polite restraint. But once the chatter turned to after-dinner drinks, she excused herself, murmuring something about rest, and slipped away to the guest room. The door closed behind her with a click too soft to match the force inside her. She stood still, palms flat to the wood, breathing shallowly. The lamplight fell warm across the bedspread, but there was no comfort in it. Her hand rose to her throat, fingers grazing the pearl, Robert's gift from their 25th anniversary. Once they had been a token of devotion. Tonight they felt like a chain. The years unspooled in her mind. Eliza's late rent payments quietly covered, afternoons of babysitting dropped in her lap, casseroles delivered without thanks after Mark's surgery. She remembered sitting in hospital corridors, holding her daughter's hand through fear, through heartbreak. Those moments had once bound them close. Now it seemed they had simply emboldened Eliza to take more. This wasn't the first time her daughter had cut her down in front of others. It was simply the sharpest. She crossed to the dresser, where a small velvet box lay among her belongings. She opened it. A perfect strand of pearls gleamed on the satin lining, the gift she had chosen for Eliza. Now they looked like a private joke at her expense, not just a gift, she thought, but a statement, one she no longer wished to make. Grace closed the box slowly, her fingers firm on the clasp. She slipped it into her handbag, the gesture final. From the same bag, she drew her phone and scrolled to Stephen Calder's number. When he answered, she kept her voice measured. "I need to discuss something sensitive." She gave him the bare facts, the remark at dinner, the history behind it, the witnesses who had laughed. She asked about emotional distress claims, about inheritance law, about what she could legally put in writing. Stephen hesitated. "You're talking about changing your will?" "Yes," she said, "and I want to know every option before I do." They spoke for several minutes, his voice steady, hers sharper than she expected. When she hung up, the room felt different, less like a refuge, more like a staging ground. She sat at the desk, pulling a legal pad toward her. On one side, she listed assets, the lake cabin, the antique clock, the bonds Robert had bought for the grandchildren. On the other, she wrote names. Family, yes, but not all would remain. A small tremor passed through her hand. Fear, perhaps, at stepping into a kind of fight she'd never imagined. But beneath it something steadier, resolve. She reached for her stationery. "Dear Stephen," she wrote, "following our call tonight, I am initiating steps to protect both my dignity and my legacy. Continued disregard will not go unanswered." Her script was neat, deliberate, as though each stroke was cutting away years of silence. By the time she signed her name, the decision felt immovable. She slid the page into an envelope, pressing the seal flat beneath her palm. It felt almost weightless. She knew better. Grace set it beside her bag, on the nightstand. Tomorrow it would go into the post. She glanced once toward the velvet box, its contents hidden from view. A faint knowing smile curved her lips, because by this time next Christmas, Eliza would understand exactly how much a burden in pearls could take away. It was time to stop being a passive player in my own life. I was ready to fight for what was mine. The snow outside Stephen Calder's office lay untouched, the kind that muffled sound and made the world feel suspended. Grace stepped inside, the scent of polished wood and paper reminding her of Robert's business meetings years ago. Stephen rose from behind his desk, offering a hand she didn't take. She wasn't here for courtesies. They sat. She placed the velvet box on the desk, unopened between them. "This," she said, "was meant for Eliza. Now it's a prop." Stephen's brow lifted. "A symbol, a warning," Grace replied, "and I want it backed with legal teeth." She told him everything. Eliza's remark at Christmas, the laughter, the years of smaller cuts that had led to this moment. Stephen listened without interruption, his fingers steep. "You could pursue a claim for intentional infliction of emotional distress," he said finally. Her words, especially in front of witnesses, could be argued as public humiliation. Grace felt her shoulders drop, tension releasing into resolve. "And my estate." He slid a folder toward her. "We revise your will. Assets can be redirected. Conditions can be placed on any inheritance." She opened the folder. Her lake cabin, the antique clock, the investment bonds, each could be shielded. She imagined Eliza's face when she learned that entitlement had consequence. They discussed witness statements, the possibility of mediation, and how a lawsuit served on Christmas Day would cut through the quiet cruelty like glass through silk. When she left the office, the box was back in her handbag, heavier now with meaning. That night she spread Stephen's documents across her kitchen table. The lamplight caught on her pearls, still at her throat, and she touched them absently. No longer a chain, they felt like armor. She began drafting the language for her will, writing in her own steady hand. Any beneficiary who engages in acts of cruelty, harassment, or public disparagement toward the testator shall be disinherited. The words felt clean, like fresh snow covering old tracks. She paused once, pen hovering, thinking of the ripples this would cause. Siblings divided, whispers at gatherings, Eliza spinning her own version of events. But peace wasn't born from avoiding conflict. It was carved out by standing firm. By midnight, the will's revisions were complete, the emotional distress claim outlined in Stephen's draft. The lawsuit would be printed and sealed in an envelope marked personal and confidential. She'd hand it to Eliza alongside the pearls, both a gift and a mirror. The following morning, Grace rehearsed the moment in her head. Eliza would open the box first, fingers brushing the necklace, the faintest flicker of surprise softening her. Then Grace would slide the envelope across the table, her voice even, "This is also for you." Doubt crept in as she poured her coffee. Was this too much? Too final? But then she heard again the laughter at the Christmas table, saw the way no one met her eyes. That sound was her answer. She picked up the pen one last time and signed the lawsuit papers. The clock in the hall struck 10. She sealed the envelope and set it beside the velvet box. Grace stood at the window, watching the snow thicken over the street. Her reflection stared back, chin lifted, eyes clear. The years of biting her tongue were over. Whatever storm her actions brought, she would meet it head on, because she would no longer be silenced by her own family. I handed Eliza the pearls, but inside the box was something much more precious, her future in my hands. Christmas morning dawned sharp and clear, the kind of winter light that made everything look a little too honest. Grace took her time dressing. The pearls Robert had given her rested, as always, against her collarbone, but today they felt like a crest, quiet authority in a strand of white. Downstairs, the living room was warm with the smell of cinnamon and pine, wrapping paper crinkled underfoot. Eliza moved from guest to guest, topping off glasses of champagne. When she reached Grace, her smile was polite, practical. "Merry Christmas, Mum," she said, accepting the kiss Grace offered like one might accept a delivery. Grace reached into her bag and withdrew the small velvet box. "For you," she said simply. Eliza's brow furrowed, her eyes flicking from the box to Grace's face, searching for the cat. But she took it, settling onto the sofa to open it. The lid lifted with a faint creak. Inside, the pearls lay coiled like a perfect little moonlit snake, the satin glinting beneath them. But there was something else. An envelope, crisp and cream, tucked under the necklace. Eliza pinched it between two fingers. "What's this?" Grace's voice was even. "Read it." The room quieted without anyone asking why. Children paused mid-tier of wrapping paper. Mark leaned forward, curiosity pricking his expression. Eliza slid the paper out and unfolded it. Her eyes moved across the page, the color in her face shifting from pink to something hotter, sharper. She read the first paragraph twice, then looked up. "This is a joke." "It isn't," Grace said. Mark took the letter from her and scanned it. "You're suing for emotional distress." He blinked. "From your own daughter?" Grace stood, the pearls at her throat catching the light. "From a woman who has for years humiliated and belittled me." "Yes." She looked to the rest of the family, their expressions a mix of discomfort and fascination. "This is not just about one night. It's about a pattern, and it ends here." Eliza gave a small, incredulous laugh. "Oh, don't be dramatic." Grace didn't raise her voice, but the steel in it cut through the space. "You called me a burden in pearls in front of our family. You laughed with them. You have made my life smaller every chance you had. I will not leave my home, my work or my dignity in the hands of someone who treats me like that." The letter hung between them, heavy as and Grace continued, her gaze steady on Eliza's. "This lawsuit also contests your claim to my inheritance." the lake cabin, the bonds, even the antiques. Until this is resolved, they are locked. You will not touch a penny of it without the court's approval." The air in the room seemed to shift, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. Mark's mouth opened, then shut again. One cousin muttered something under his breath. Lucy from the armchair in the corner gave Grace the faintest nod. Eliza's hands trembled as she shoved the pearls back into the box. "You can't do this. I already have," Grace said. There was no triumph in her tone, only certainty. "You think this will make you look strong?" Eliza's voice rose. "All you've done is embarrass yourself, and me." Grace felt the old impulse to retreat, to smooth the edges, to make peace, but she stood her ground. "If protecting myself embarrasses you, then perhaps you should think about why." For a long moment, no one moved. The fire crackled in the grate, the only sound in the room. Eliza's eyes glittered, not with tears but with the heat of a cornered animal. She leaned forward, her voice low enough for only those nearest to hear. "You've just made the worst mistake of your life, Mother. I will ruin you." Gasps broke the silence. The family froze, caught between shock and the uneasy knowledge that the real battle had just begun. Grace didn't flinch, because for the first time in decades, the fight was on her terms. The silence after Eliza's threat clung to the room like thick smoke. Every breath felt measured, every movement slow, as if no one wanted to be the first to break it. Grace stayed standing, her shoulders square, the light from the Christmas tree casting fractured gold across her face. She could feel the tremor of her heartbeat, but kept her voice calm. "This isn't about ruining you, Eliza. It's about protecting myself." Eliza laughed sharply. "You're rewriting history. This is vindictive, pure and simple." Mark shifted forward on the sofa, his voice a practiced blend of husband and diplomat. "Let's not escalate." Grace cut him off with a look. "You've both had years to keep things civil. You chose otherwise." Murmurs rippled through the room. Lucy, still in the corner armchair, kept her gaze locked on Grace, a faint nod of quiet approval in her posture. A nephew avoided eye contact, fidgeting with the ribbon from a gift. The split in the family wasn't forming, it had always been there. Tonight only made it visible. Eliza's voice dropped, heavy with accusation. "You've been planning this for months, haven't you? Just waiting for a moment to humiliate me in front of everyone." Grace's fingers rested lightly on the velvet box. "If I'd wanted to humiliate you, Eliza, this would have happened years ago. This isn't about spectacle, it's about boundaries you've ignored for too long." Mark's jaw tightened. "You could have come to us privately." "I did," Grace said, her eyes never leaving Eliza. "You laughed, you dismissed me. And you made sure everyone else in this room followed your lead." The fire cracked in the hearth, a small punctuation to the heavy word. Cousin Margaret, who hadn't spoken all evening, finally leaned forward. "She's right, I've heard the way you speak to her. We all have." Eliza whipped her head toward her. "Stay out of this." Margaret didn't flinch. "Maybe it's time someone did." The tension thickened, threads pulling tighter with each word. Grace could feel the divide hardening, but she welcomed it. Lines needed to be drawn. "You think I won't fight you?" Eliza's voice sharpened. "You've just started a war you can't win." Grace's answer came evenly. "This isn't a war, it's the consequence of your choices." Somewhere near the doorway, a child whispered to another, quickly shushed by their mother. The small sound only made the room feel more brittle. Eliza's face flushed deep red. "You've embarrassed me. You've embarrassed my family." Grace's laugh was low, but it carried. "Then you should be grateful I've spared you years of further embarrassment by making my stance clear now." Mark stepped forward, placing himself between them, one hand out. "Enough. This is Christmas." "Christmas," Grace said softly, "is why I chose today. Families gather, memories are made, and I'm making sure mine remembers that dignity matters more than keeping the peace." Lucy's voice broke the pause. "It takes more strength to stand up to your own blood than to strangers." Eliza turned on her. "You can have her then." She snatched the letter from Mark's hand, crumpling it in her fist. "You've made your choice, Mother. Don't come crying to me when this blows up in your face." Grace met her gaze. "I won't." The words landed like stone. Without another glance, Eliza swept up her coat from the back of the sofa. Mark hesitated, glancing between them, then followed her toward the hall. The front door opened, letting in a burst of winter air, then shut hard enough to rattle the ornaments on the tree. The room exhaled slowly, but the quiet was different now. Fractured, unsettled, Grace sat, the pearls cool at her throat. She could feel every pair of eyes still on her, but she didn't look away from the door. She knew the cost of what she'd done. She also knew she wouldn't undo it. Her phone vibrated against the armrest. She lifted it, the screen lighting her face. A single message from Eliza. "This isn't over. You'll regret it." Grace's thumb hovered over the screen. A slow, steady breath filled her lungs. She locked the phone, set it face down, and stared into the fire, because whatever came next, she would meet it head-on. Unflinched, the message glowed on Grace's phone screen, stark against the firelight. "This isn't over. You'll regret it." She read it twice. The phrasing wasn't impulsive. It had the cold weight of a promise. Another message arrived before she could set the phone down. "You've betrayed me. Everyone will know who you really are." The room still hummed faintly from the earlier confrontation. Low murmurs, the clink of a glass, but her focus narrowed to those sentences. A third notification. "I'll turn the family against you. They won't stand with someone trying to destroy her own daughter. Then, you've got secrets too. I'll tell them everything." Secrets. A calculated word meant to shake her. It didn't. She'd already built her defenses. Legal and emotional. She set the phone face down, letting the fire's heat settle against her skin. Eliza wasn't just lashing out now. She was plotting. Grace rose, pearls cool at her throat, and stepped into the hallway where the voices dulled. She dialed Stephen Calder. He answered on the second ring. "Grace, I was going to check in after the holiday. It started," she said. "Threats, accusations, turning the family against me. Claims about secrets." Stephen's tone sharpened. "Document them. Every message, time-stamped." "I have. She's trying to scare me." "That's intimidation. Forward them to me. I'll add them to the claim. If it continues, we can seek an injunction." Grace leaned against the wall, absorbing his calm. "It's working, Stephen. Not to change my mind, but I feel it." "That's the point," he said. "But you're already positioned well. Don't give her grounds to claim escalation." She ended the call, the phone warm in her hand. Eliza's threats replayed in her mind, but now they had context, evidence. When she re-entered the living room, a few pairs of eyes flicked toward her, then away. Lucy gave a faint nod from across the room. Grace sat, not hiding, just present. Another buzz. "If you cared about this family, you'd stop now." Her reply was measured. "I care enough to end the cycle you've kept alive." She hit send and tucked the phone into her bag. The rest of the afternoon moved slowly. Guests drifted out, coats pulled close, goodbyes brief. Grace stayed until the last door closed, the silence settling like snow. In her room, she opened Stephen's email, confirmation he'd received the screenshots. "We proceed as discussed. Stand firm." She closed the laptop, moving to the window. Outside, streetlights caught the snow in soft halos. Somewhere beyond the glass, Eliza was already rewriting the narrative, casting herself as the wronged daughter. Grace had seen her do it before to others, but this time Grace was ready. She had the proof, the will and the plan. She turned from the window, unfastening her pearls and laying them on the dresser. Without them, her neck felt lighter. She sat on the bed, letting the day's weight leave her shoulders. The phone buzzed once more. "Enjoy the time you have left in that house. It won't be yours for long." Grace's jaw tightened. For the first time since dinner, a flicker of uncertainty cut through her resolve. She had won the first move, but the fight ahead would be longer, and Eliza's reach inside the family was deep. She powered the phone off, lay back, and stared at the ceiling. The question pressed in, sharper than the threat itself. When the dust settled, would the family stand beside her, or would Eliza pull them away, one by one? The first morning in court, felt like stepping onto a battlefield. The wood-paneled room was warm, but Grace's hands were cold as she smoothed her skirt. Stephen sat beside her, calm and deliberate, flipping through his notes. Across the aisle, Eliza leaned toward her attorney, a poised woman in a navy suit whose composure suggested experience in dismantling opponents. Their whispers stopped when the clerk called the case. Eliza's lawyer rose first. "This is not a case about dignity," she told the jury. "It is about an emotionally unstable woman, advanced in age, acting from vindictiveness toward her own child." The words were precise, meant to sting. Stephen stood slowly. "We will show, through testimony and documented correspondence, that my client endured sustained emotional harm at the defendant's hands. This is about protection, not spite." The media had already taken interest. Reporters filled the back row, and camera crews waited in the hall. Headlines reduced years of pain to a soundbite. Mother sues daughter, over burden in Pearl's remark. By the second day, Grace felt the strain. At night she scanned online articles, reading both praise and criticism. Some called her courageous, others painted her as greedy. She told herself none of it mattered, but the words followed her into court. Eliza's attorney pressed the advantage. She displayed Grace's medical records, implying fragility. "Mrs. Whitaker," she asked, "is it possible you misinterpreted my client's words?" Grace met her eyes. "No." Stephen countered with the audio recording. Eliza's voice making the burden in Pearl's comment, followed by laughter. The room shifted as the sound played. Grace testified herself, recounting years of belittlement, small humiliations at gatherings, exclusion from decisions about her own property, the public insult at Christmas. Under cross-examination, Eliza's lawyer pressed, "You're saying one comment caused severe distress?" "It was the last I was willing to ignore," Grace answered. Witnesses came and went, cousins who had overheard insults, friends who'd seen her in tears, Lucy, who spoke of watching Eliza's respect fade over time. Eliza's side countered with cards Grace had sent in better years, suggesting the will changes were spiteful. They painted her as manipulative, hinting she'd rallied relatives for her own ends. By week 4, fatigue set in. Grace maintained her composure in court, but in her hotel room she felt the grind. Stephen noticed. "We knew it would be ugly," he said quietly. "You're holding the line." Outside court, Eliza smiled for cameras, chatted with reporters, and posed for photos. Grace's refusal to engage made her seem distant to some onlookers. The trial dragged on, each side presenting carefully built arguments. Grace understood the stakes. Losing meant not just financial loss, but a public narrative she'd never control. On the 23rd day, during a recess, Stephen leaned close. "Major development." Eliza's team reached out. Grace straightened. "Terms? Not yet. They're pushing for a settlement." The gavel fell, adjourning court for the day, but Grace stayed seated. Settlement could mean retreat, or strategy. She didn't know which, but she knew the battle had shifted. Leaving the courthouse, cameras closing in, Grace felt the cold air bite her cheeks, and wondered whether the next fight would unfold before the judge, or behind closed doors. The call came that evening, while Grace sat at the small desk in her hotel room, her pearls resting on the nightstand. Stephen's voice was low, deliberate. Eliza's team sent terms. Grace stared out at the city's winter lights, each one blurred through the glass. "And they're offering a financial settlement, a sizable one. Both sides walk away. No admissions. No more court." For a moment the thought of ending it was almost tempting. No more reporters crowding the courthouse steps. No more strangers judging her from the gallery. Just quiet. "What's the figure?" she asked. Stephen told her. It was enough to repair the lake cabin twice over. Enough to live comfortably for years. But it wasn't the whole picture. It came with a confidentiality clause that would erase her side of the story. "They want you to sign, take the money, and never speak of this again," Stephen said. Grace closed her eyes. "So the record stays hers?" "Yes." The next morning, Eliza approached her outside the courtroom, flanked by her lawyer. Her smile was tight, but there was a flash of confidence in her eyes. "Take it, mother. This can be over. We both get something. No one has to lose." Grace met her gaze, searching for sincerity and finding only calculation. And what do you get? Peace. Eliza said, and you don't get dragged through the mud any longer. It almost sounded like mercy. Almost. In Stephen's office later, he leaned across the desk. They'll pressure you. Friends, family, even mutual acquaintances will tell you to let this go. Be prepared. They already are, Grace replied. By the third week the toll was evident. Her sleep was fractured, her appetite minimal. She caught her reflection in the hotel mirror one morning and barely recognized the woman staring back. Cheekbones sharper, eyes shadowed. She asked herself more than once if she was clinging to the fight out of principle or stubbornness. If ending it now would give her the peace she claimed to be seeking. But each time the memory returned. The laughter at Christmas, the dismissal, the years of slow erosion to her dignity. Money could not rewrite that. Silence would only cement it. This isn't about the number, she told Stephen one afternoon. It's about the fact that she thinks she can buy my silence. That's what I'm refusing. Stephen studied her for a moment, before nodding. Then we keep going. That night, in her room, Grace sifted through the documents Stephen had provided, bank statements, trust ledgers, property records. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, only that she needed something that would tip the balance. It was in the fifth folder, an annotated trust report that she found it. 2 transfers, small enough to avoid automatic scrutiny, but regular, each one routed through a holding company tied back to Eliza. Grace read the details twice, her pulse quickening. If those funds had been moved without the trustee's approval, it could mean Eliza had been skimming from the family trust for months, maybe longer. She called Stephen immediately. I think I found something. He arrived an hour later, hair damp from the snow, and spread the papers across the desk. His eyes narrowed as he traced the routing numbers. If this holds, it's not just breach of trust, it's fraud. And it changes everything? It could, he said. It shifts the narrative entirely. She's no longer the dutiful daughter fighting her mother's accusations. She becomes the one with something to hide. Grace sat back, letting the realization settle. The fight was no longer just about what had been said. It was about what had been done, quietly, in the shadows. Will we present it? She asked. After I verify the transfers, yes, but this could alter the outcome of the case entirely. Grace glanced toward the window. Outside, the city was blanketed in snow, streetlights glowing against the white. For the first time in weeks, she felt the faint stirrings of advantage. Stephen began gathering the files. I'll have this ready for court. As he left, Grace's fingers lingered on the evidence, knowing that soon, the truth would be laid out in front of everyone, and the balance of power might shift in ways Eliza could never have planned. The revelation shook me to my core. Eliza had been hiding something that could ruin her. The courtroom was a held breath, as Stephen rose, a folder in his hand. Grace sat still, the faint glint of her pearls steady against her collarbone. Your Honor, Stephen said. New evidence has emerged. Records showing the defendant moved funds from the family trust into a holding company she controls. The judge's brow lifted. Eliza's lawyer froze mid-note. Stephen laid out the trail. 2 years of small irregular withdrawals routed through a shell company tied to Eliza, unapproved by the trustee, unreported to beneficiaries. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Grace felt the shift in the air. The judge looked to the defense. Eliza's lawyer rose. These were administrative reallocations, standard asset management. Stephen countered. Standard procedure doesn't require concealment. He held up a notarized statement from the trustee, confirming no approval had been given. Color drained from Eliza's face. It's being twisted, she blurted, breaking protocol. The funds were temporary, meant for investment opportunities. The gavel struck. You will speak through counsel, Ms. Whitaker. Grace watched, calm now. For weeks she'd been on the defensive. Now the ground tilted her way. Stephen produced one last page. Exhibit 42. A bank verification tying the holding account to Ms. Whitaker's personal expenses. Eliza's lawyer bent toward her in hurried whispers. Grace saw the tremor in her daughter's hands. The judge admitted the evidence. Stephen sat beside Grace. This is the kind of truth juries remember. She inhaled, steady. Her gaze stayed forward on the neutral space between sides. Cross-examination shifted. The defense framed the transfers as liquidity management, but the trustee's testimony dismantled it. No, I did not approve them. No, I was not informed until subpoenaed. By midday, jurors' eyes told their own story, cool, assessing less sympathetic to Eliza. When court recessed for lunch, the hallway buzzed. Reporters called Stephen's name. He ignored them. Grace slipped past quietly, the chatter fading. In a conference room, Stephen shut the door. You handled that perfectly, silent, composed. It felt like the first real turn, Grace said. It was. If this sticks, settlement talks tilt to you or we go for a ruling outright. Back in court, Stephen's redirect was brief and pointed, leaving the documents to speak. Eliza sat rigid, eyes fixed ahead. Once her gaze slid toward Grace, anger and calculation mingling, but Grace didn't meet it. Testimony closed for the day. The judge's voice cut through. Given the gravity of this evidence, the court will recess until tomorrow, so both parties may prepare further arguments. The gavel's strike echoed. Papers rustled. Chairs scraped. Grace rose slowly, aware of eyes on her, some curious, some approving. Near the aisle, Eliza stepped into her path, perfume sharp. Her smile was thin. You think this changes anything, she murmured. It's a bump. I'll survive. And when I do, you'll wish you'd taken the settlement. Grace didn't answer. She stepped past her daughter, pearls cool against her skin, walking toward the door. Behind her, the weight of the day lingered. Ahead, there was the knowledge that truth had finally entered the light. The judge's recess left the next day's ruling, and the fate of the case hanging in the balance. The final ruling was set to come, and it would either shatter me or restore my place in the family. The courtroom was silent enough to hear the rustle of the judge's robe as she returned to the bench. Grace's hands rested in her lap, still and steady. Across the aisle, Eliza sat rigid, her lawyer whispering one last time, before the gavel struck. Having reviewed all evidence, the judge began. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mrs. Grace Whitaker. The words seemed to hang in the air before they sank in. You are awarded full control of the Whitaker estate. The defendant's claims are dismissed. A faint murmur swept the gallery. Grace felt the air leave her lungs in a slow, controlled exhale. She didn't look at Eliza yet. The judge's voice continued, firm but measured. However, the court recognizes the familial nature of this dispute. Whitaker, you are ordered to make a reasonable attempt at reconciliation with the defendant before year's end. This will not affect today's ruling, but it is strongly encouraged. Stephen's hand touched Grace's arm, a grounding gesture. She nodded once, accepting the balance of victory and obligation. Eliza's eyes stayed fixed on the bench, her jaw tight. The gavel fell again. This court is adjourned. The sound echoed like the close of a chapter. Chairs scraped. Reporters moved toward the aisle. Grace rose slowly, the pearls at her collarbone cool against her skin. Outside the courtroom, flashes popped from cameras. Stephen guided her through the crowd, answering no questions. Only when they reached a quiet corridor did he speak. You did it, Grace. It's over. Not entirely, she said. The reconciliation order lingered in her mind. They walked to his office in near silence, winter light pooling on the marble floor. Inside, Stephen poured coffee. The judge's order is symbolic, he said. It won't undo the verdict. Symbolic or not, Grace replied. It means I have to face her again. Stephen studied her. Do you want to? Grace didn't answer immediately. She thought of Christmases long past, of the way Eliza's laughter used to sound before it hardened. Somewhere under the anger, there had once been love, but she wasn't sure it could survive this. Later she returned alone to the hotel. The city was dressed in frost, the streets glistening under lamplight. In her room she set her bag down, and removed the pearls, laying them carefully on the dresser. Victory felt strange. It wasn't elation, but quiet reclamation. Her estate, her dignity, her name restored. Yet the distance between her and her daughter felt wider than ever. She poured tea and sat by the window, watching snow drift past the glass. In the distance, bells marked the hour. She wondered what reconciliation would even look like. Would Eliza meet her halfway, or twist the meeting into another stage for control? A knock at her door broke the thought. A bellhop handed her a plain envelope. Inside was a single card, unsigned, "We're not finished." Grace closed the card. She had expected silence. Not another volley. The judge's order might force them into the same room, but the gulf between them felt immovable. She opened her phone and checked the calendar. The year's end was weeks away. She would keep the meeting civil, but she would not bend. The tea cooled beside her. Snow thickened outside, turning the city into a blur of white and shadow. Her phone rang, sharp in the quiet. She answered without checking the ID. Grace, a man's voice said, familiar from a lifetime ago. I'm in town. We need to talk. It's about Eliza. Her grip tightened on the armrest. Who is this? It's Robert, the voice replied, and I think I can explain everything. The line went dead. Grace sat frozen, the phone still in her hand, the weight of his words pressing in. Whatever she thought she knew about the fight with Eliza might be about to change completely. The visitor wasn't someone I'd expected to see, but their arrival could change everything. The knock came just after dusk. Grace had been sitting by the window, watching snow fall in slow, deliberate flakes, when it sounded 3 sharp raps that didn't feel like a neighbor's courtesy call. She rose, the pearls cool at her throat, and opened the door. A woman stood in the hallway, coat dusted white. Time had sharpened her cheekbones, but Grace knew her instantly. Margot, she breathed. Her sister gave a faint smile. May I come in? They hadn't spoken in over a decade, not since a bitter argument after their mother's funeral. Yet here she was, carrying a leather satchel and an expression shaped by caution. Inside, Margot removed her coat, glancing at the tea cooling on the table. You're in the middle of something, she said. Only waiting, Grace replied. Margot sat, placing the satchel between them. I heard about the case. It's why I came. Grace braced herself. To talk me out of it. No, Margot said. To tell you something you need to know. From the satchel she drew a folder, edges worn, paper yellowed with age. Do you remember Father's old investment account? The one we couldn't access after he died? Grace nodded slowly. It was dissolved. That's what we were told. Margot opened the folder. It wasn't. It was rolled into a separate trust, one only I knew about, because he named me as co-trustee. I left it untouched, until now. Grace scanned the documents, account statements, property deeds, ledgers. The numbers were staggering. This is significant. Eliza doesn't know it exists, Margot said. Most assets are in your name. You could secure your position forever. Grace felt her pulse quicken. Why tell me now? Because you're fighting for more than yourself, Margot said. This estate is our family's history. Eliza can't dismantle it. Grace sat back, the folder heavy in her lap. She thought of the court battles, the settlement offer, the endless pressure to concede. This was leverage unlike anything she'd had. Margot leaned in. One property, a vineyard in Devon, is still generating income. If you take control, you can finance the next stage of your case. Eliza can't match it without revealing her own misconduct. Grace closed the folder. You realize this changes everything. That's why I'm here. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the clock's ticking. Grace studied her sister, the lines of weariness, the flicker of shared purpose. They'd been at odds for years, yet here was Margot, crossing that gulf with a single act. What's the catch? Grace asked. Margot's smile was wry. No catch. Just, don't waste it. Grace rose and carried the folder to the desk. She opened Stephen's number on her phone. We'll need to move quickly. Margot stood too, pulling on her coat. I'll leave the rest in your hands. But Grace, don't let her see you hesitate. When the door closed, Grace returned to the desk. The snow outside was thicker now, muffling the city into quiet. She spread the documents out, arranging them like a puzzle, finally making sense. With these assets, she could maintain control of the estate and shield it from Eliza entirely. The thought was intoxicating. For the first time since the fight began, she felt not just defensive, but dominant. Her phone buzzed. A message from Stephen. Call me as soon as possible. I have updates. She typed back. You'll want to see what I've got too. Then she gathered the papers into a neat stack, bound them with an elastic band, and placed them in her bag. This was no longer just a court case. It was a game of endurance, and she'd just been handed the winning move. She poured fresh tea but barely touched it. Her thoughts ran ahead to the coming days. She would reveal the trust at the right moment, forcing Eliza into a position she couldn't spin or deny. It would send ripples through the family, but they'd be on Grace's terms. The wind outside picked up, rattling the window. Somewhere in the dark, the next phase of the battle waited. Grace tightened her grip on the satchel, feeling the weight of the trust inside. Whatever shockwaves it caused, she was ready, because this time, victory felt inevitable. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the final confrontation with Eliza. Grace chose the Whitaker Library, a room soaked in the scent of old wood and older arguments. Afternoon light filtered through tall windows, striping the carpet in gold. She placed the satchel on the table, its weight deliberate. Eliza entered without knocking, her heels sharp on the parquet. "You said it was urgent." "It is," Grace replied, unclasping the satchel. She withdrew the folder Margot had given her and slid it across the table. "You might want to sit." Eliza remained standing. "What's this?" "Proof," Grace said, "of the trust father left. Assets you didn't know about." Eliza's eyes narrowed. "If this is another one of your, look at the dates." Grace cut in. "The whole income stream from Devon. It's all in my name." Eliza's gaze dropped to the pages. Color drained from her face. "How?" "Margot," Grace said. "She was co-trustee. She's given it to me." For a moment, the only sound was the slow tick of the mantel clock. Eliza's fingers tightened on the folder. Grace leaned forward. "This isn't just about winning in court anymore. This is about safeguarding the family's history from you." Eliza's voice came low, strained. "You've been planning this." "No, Grace, I'm giving you a chance, one last chance, to tell the truth, to reconcile before we lose what little is left." Eliza laughed once, without humor. "Reconcile? After dragging me through court? After smearing me in front of the family?" "You did that to yourself," Grace replied, her tone flat. "This is your moment to take responsibility." Eliza snapped the folder shut. "And if I don't, then this becomes public," Grace said. "Every transfer, every false statement. The trust will ensure you have no influence here again." A flush rose on Eliza's cheeks. "You'd cut me out entirely?" "You already cut yourself out," Grace said. "I'm just making it official." For a heartbeat, they stared at each other, mother and daughter, both holding their ground. The years between them felt like a chasm too wide to bridge. Eliza broke first, shoving the folder back across the table. "Keep your dusty trust. You've poisoned this family enough." Grace closed the satchel. The weight inside felt different now, not potential but conclusion. "Then we're done." The door opened behind Eliza. Lucy stepped in, eyes flicking between them. "Is everything—" "It's fine," Grace said before Eliza could speak. Eliza turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. "You think this is your victory," she said, her voice carrying a new edge. "It's not. One day you'll regret cutting me out, and when you do, I won't be here." Grace didn't answer. She watched her daughter's back retreat down the corridor, heels striking in diminishing rhythm. Lucy approached. "That's it then." "That's it," Grace said. Her voice was steady, but inside she felt the final thread between them snap. The library seemed larger once Eliza was gone, the air less taut. Grace sat, resting her hand on the satchel. She thought of the vineyard, the untouched accounts, the control now firmly in her hands. It was security, but not the kind she'd ever wanted to win this way. Lucy lingered at the door. "Will you try again?" "The judge's order. I'll meet the requirement," Grace said. "But reconciliation is more than a meeting." She made her choice. They stood in silence for a moment. Outside, wind rattled the bare branches against the window. When Lucy left, Grace remained at the table. She traced the grain of the wood beneath her fingertips, remembering holidays spent here, the sound of Eliza's younger laughter, the warmth that had once lived in these walls. All of it now felt like a story that belonged to someone else. She rose, slipping the satchel over her arm. There was no triumph in her step, only a quiet certainty. This chapter was closing, As she reached the hall, her phone buzzed. A message from Eliza. "You still have one choice left. Make it before it's too late." Grace stared at the words, her breath catching. The decision the message demanded loomed heavier than the trial, heavier than the trust. Grace stood in the quiet hall, the satchel at her side, wondering whether the final choice was to forgive or to walk away forever. The battle was over, but the scars would remain forever. Winter loosened its grip slowly. Weeks after the final confrontation, Grace stood on the terrace of the Whitaker estate, watching pale sunlight stretch across the frost-silvered lawn. The satchel from that day was gone, its contents locked in the study safe, but its weight still lingered in her memory. Inside, the house felt different, quieter though not empty. She had dismissed the staff for the afternoon, choosing solitude over polite chatter. In the kitchen she brewed tea, the sound of boiling water oddly comforting. She no longer sought anyone's approval. That need had dissolved with the verdict. Now her decisions were hers alone. Where to live, how to spend her time, who to let in. The estate's affairs moved forward under her sole authority, papers signed with her pen, sealed with her will. Travel came first. In March she walked along the canals of Venice, alone but unlonely, feeding sparrows on damp stone steps. In April she wandered the streets of Lisbon, notebook in hand, sketching tiled facades. She bought herself a leather-bound journal, and filled it with impressions, the smell of salt in Marseille, the cold bite of champagne in Paris. Back home she found new ritual. Mornings in the library with a novel and coffee. Afternoons tending to the neglected rose garden, gloves and trowel replacing courtroom nerves. She joined a ceramics class at the community center, her hands learning the slow discipline of shaping clay. The estate itself transformed under her care, legal disputes settled, deeds transferred, accounts consolidated. She earmarked a portion of the trust for restoration projects. A crumbling carriage house, the overgrown orchard. Each decision felt like stitching a torn fabric. Thread by thread, some family members drifted back into her orbit. Cousin Margaret visited with her children, filling the halls with laughter. Lucy became a regular presence, helping with archives and photographs. Old tensions softened, though not entirely dissolved. But the space where Eliza should have been remained vacant. There were no calls, no visits, no shared meals. The absence was sharp at first, then duller, like a scar that no longer aches but never fades. Grace told herself she had accepted it. Some doors, once closed, stayed that way. Still, in quiet moments, she caught herself remembering Eliza as a child in the orchard, hair tangled by the wind. Eliza at 16, triumphant with her first debate trophy. Fragments of love that existed before the years wore them thin. One evening in late summer, a letter arrived. No return address, only her name in handwriting she knew as well as her own. She took it to the library, the same room where the last battle had been fought. The envelope was unsealed, as if Eliza hadn't trusted herself to finish the gesture. Inside, a single sheet. The words were brief, almost brittle. "We've both said and done things we can't undo. I'm not ready to forget, but maybe I'm ready to speak. If you are, let me know." No apology, no plea, but it wasn't nothing. Grace read it twice, then set it down beside her teacup. She walked to the window. The late sun washed the garden in gold, touching the roses she'd coaxed back into bloom. Somewhere beyond the hedge, the world moved on, indifferent to family feuds, court rulings or hidden trusts. Her hand rested on the letter. She thought of what reconciliation might mean now, not surrender, not forgetting, but perhaps a cautious bridge over the wreckage. She also thought of the peace she'd found, the self she'd rebuilt without Eliza's shadow pressing in. In the end, it came down to choice. Hers. The mantel clock struck 7. Outside, the first bats flitted in the twilight. Grace folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. She placed it in the top drawer of her desk, locking it with a small brass key. She would decide tomorrow, next week, or never. There was no deadline now but the one she set. Her tea had cooled. She poured it away and drew the curtains, shutting out the view. The room settled into lamplight and quiet, the air faintly scented with roses. She touched the drawer once more before leaving, feeling the thin shape of the envelope through the wood. In it lay a path she could take, or leave untouched. Grace stood in the doorway, the letter's weight still in her mind, knowing she was at a crossroads. One step could open the door to forgiveness, or close it forever. Rebuilding my legacy wasn't just about money, it was about my self-worth. Morning sunlight spilled into the Whitaker Conservatory, igniting the glass panes with soft gold. Grace stood barefoot on the tiled floor, a watering can in hand, tending to the orchids that now filled the space. Their petals, once drooping, stood proud again, like the estate no longer felt like a battlefield. It was hers, wholly and without question. The years of litigation and cold silences had left their marks, but she no longer measured herself against them. The need to prove anything, to Eliza, to the family, even to the town, had drained away. What remained was quieter, deeper, the knowledge that she had done what was necessary, and had done it on her terms. Her days had a new rhythm. Mornings began with walks along the orchard path, where frost clung to the grass in winter, and wildflowers nodded in summer. Afternoons were for projects that had nothing to do with profit or preservation, just joy. She painted the south-facing garden wall a soft cream, hung wind chimes at the veranda, and planted lavender along the drive. The house seemed to exhale with her. She'd also begun to fill it again, but not with the same people. A circle of friends from her ceramics class, now gathered in the dining room once a month, their laughter spilling down the hall. Neighbors stopped by with fresh bread or to trade plants for her roses. In place of strained family dinners, she hosted book club evenings and small concerts in the music room. Her favorite hours were spent at the community center. Twice a week she volunteered in the literacy program, sitting beside teenagers and retirees alike, guiding their fingers across words until the sentences took shape. It was a quiet work, but it filled something in her that winning the estate never had. Stephen had suggested she write her account of the case, for legal clarity if nothing else. But Grace decided on something broader. In the corner of the library, now her sanctuary, she set up a small desk, stocked with heavy paper and fountain pen. Her memoir began not with the trial, but with the orchard from her childhood, the laughter in the kitchen, the first time she'd understood that dignity was something you had to defend. The writing was slow, careful. Every word was a stone placed in the foundation of her own telling. Her evenings often ended in the conservatory again, tea steaming beside her, the air heavy with jasmine and the slow hum of the night. She painted when the mood struck, still lifes of pears from the garden, sun-washed views of Venice from memory, a portrait of the vineyard in Devon. There were moments when her gaze drifted to the locked drawer in the library, where Eliza's letter still lay. She hadn't answered, and maybe she never would. The choice had long since shifted from something urgent to something optional, a door she could walk past without regret. One autumn afternoon, Lucy visited, bringing a basket of quinces. "It feels different here now," she said, looking around the brightened hall, like the house knows it's safe again. Grace smiled faintly. Maybe it. They walked the garden together, their steps slow over the gravel. Grace no longer looked for Eliza in these moments. No shadow in the doorway, no sudden turn of reconciliation. The space was intentional now, an emptiness that allowed other things to grow. As the first frost approached, she oversaw the final stage of the carriage house restoration. Its wide doors now opened to a studio space, half for her ceramics wheel, half for the easels she'd collected. She imagined the room full of friends, music playing, clay dust on their hands, paint smudges on their cheeks. It was the future she'd chosen, unhurried, self-made, free of expectation. One crisp morning, she caught her reflection in the long mirror of the restored entry hall. The woman looking back was not the one who had walked into court all those months ago, shoulders hunched, bracing for impact. This woman stood with her spine straight, hair pulled neatly back, eyes calm. The pearls at her throat caught the light, but it was the stillness in her face that made her smile. She touched the frame of the mirror lightly. The estate was hers. The life beyond it was hers. The narrative at last was hers. The mantel clock in the library struck the hour. She turned away from the mirror and headed toward her desk, where the unfinished pages of her memoir waited. Grace sat, pen poised, and smiled at her reflection in the darkened window, ready to write the next chapter of her life, with the same confidence and peace that now defined her. The past was behind me. I was ready to create a future on my own terms. The first day of spring arrived quietly, the air soft with the scent of thawed earth. Grace stepped out onto the estate's front steps, the gravel drive glistening with dew. She carried no pearls, no satchel, only a light scarf against the morning breeze. For the first time in years, her movements felt unburdened, uncalculated. Her life had shifted from defense to creation. The long months of legal battle and bitter silences had been replaced by mornings in the garden, afternoons in the village, and evenings by lamplight with a book or brush in hand. She had stopped checking the locked drawer in the library. The letter inside no longer pulled at her. It was simply a piece of the past, like an old photograph you don't need to frame. New faces began to fill the empty chairs in her life. She invited her neighbors for Sunday suppers, each one bringing a dish to share. A retired historian named Peter became a regular presence, swapping stories with her over coffee. Friends from her ceramics class returned often, their laughter spilling into the garden. No one came expecting favors or explanations. They came because they wanted to. Travel became more than escape. It was discovery. She wandered the back streets of Florence, tracing her fingers over centuries-old stone. In Kyoto she learned the art of kintsugi, repairing a cracked teacup with veins of gold. Each journey gave her something to bring home, not in the form of trinkets, but in new skills, scents, and tastes. The bitterness she had once carried toward the family's fracture began to dissolve. Not because Eliza had changed, there had been no word from her, but because Grace realized her own life could thrive without waiting for an apology that might never come. She no longer measured her days against reconciliation or resentment. One evening, returning from a short trip to the coast, she found the carriage house studio alive with light. Inside, Lucy and two friends from the village had set up easels beside her pottery wheel. Music played softly from the corner, and the air smelled faintly of turpentine and fresh clay. Grace joined them without hesitation, losing herself in the slow curve of a ceramic vase, the way the wheel hummed under her palms. Her independence had sharpened her in unexpected ways. Decisions came more easily, whether about the estate, her travel plans, or which projects to take on. She began teaching a beginner's pottery class at the community center, her students ranging from teenagers to grandparents. Watching them shape their first uneven bowls reminded her of her own early stumbles, and of how far she had come. On the anniversary of the court's decision, she stood in the orchard at dusk. The branches were heavy with white blossoms, petals drifting down like snow. She thought of her parents, of Margot, of the long road from that first cutting remark at Christmas to this moment of peace. She didn't feel the need to mark the day with ceremony, just a quiet acknowledgement that she had made it here. Her journal filled steadily, not a memoir anymore but a collection of moments, the smell of rain on cobblestones, the taste of figs from her own garden, the sound of distant church bells in a city square. Life no longer felt like something to defend, it was something to live. One warm afternoon, she walked to the village market alone, the square alive with vendors and children darting between stalls. She bought fresh bread, early strawberries and a bouquet of sunflowers that made her smile. As she turned toward home, a stranger stopped her to compliment the flowers. They chatted for a few minutes about gardens, the weather and a new cafe opening nearby, and then went their separate ways. It was a small exchange, but it stayed with her. Connection could be that simple now. Back at the estate she arranged the sunflowers in a tall glass vase, and set them in the hall. The yellow blooms caught the afternoon light, bright and unapologetic. She paused there for a long moment, letting the quiet wrap around her. Her reflection in the hall mirror met her gaze. Calm, assured, unafraid. She had built something solid beneath her feet, something no one could take. This wasn't a victory she needed to announce. It was a life she could live in every day. She reached for her cup. Evening was settling, but the road ahead was open and she had places yet to see. Grace stepped out the door, the sun low at her back, walking into her new future, stronger, lighter, and utterly her own.